and welcome back to the Library of Parthos. My name is Sarah, and today we are talking about the sequel in a duology. We're talking about Hearts That Cut by Kika Hatzopoulou. This is going to be another video of me struggling with names and doing my best to pronounce them. So I don't have a physical copy of this book, which is why I'm holding up my phone. I read this book earlier this year as an advanced reader copy that I got off of Netgalley, and I have a lot of thoughts about this book. The summary that I'm going to give today is actually probably going to be pretty quick, and I'll kind of explain why that is in just a moment. So I would say that I classify myself as not necessarily a perfectionist, but like a completionist. So if I start something, I have to finish it, and I'm gonna do it like all the way. So here's an example of that. One of my favorite animes is Naruto. I watched every episode of Naruto, every episode of Shippuden, and I'm going through Boruto now because I keep picking it up and then stopping and waiting for more dubbed, so I'm a little behind on that. But I started watching Dragon Ball, which I'll probably share some content about that because I have a lot of thoughts about that too. But rather than watching Dragon Ball Z Kai, which is the shortened updated version, I'm going to go through and watch every single episode of Dragon Ball Z because why wouldn't I? So all that to say, usually if I read a book and it's part of a series, I read the next one as well, unless I absolutely hated it. There have been books where I was like, you know what, I'm good. For the most part, I at least need to know what happens. So this book is the last book in a duology, so the series is now complete. This read very much like a middle book in a trilogy. So what I mean by that is that it was a lot of like, traveling to this place, maybe they got into like a little bit of a scuffle here, moving on to some place else, another member of their party joins them there, they get another piece of the puzzle, then by the end of the book they have like a pretty complete piece of the puzzle, which is usually how like the second book in a trilogy goes, right? They're kind of like figuring everything out. Like in the first book, you're introduced to the problem. In the second book, you're getting all these little pieces of information. And then in the third book, like you have the complete picture, you have a plan, let's go like solve this problem. So this was like 75%, I would even say maybe like 80%, 85%, like middle book of a trilogy. And then the last 15% was like the kind of the action you would expect in the last book of a trilogy. And I also kind of felt like it was a little anticlimactic. Like there wasn't that big build. It was just kind of like, hey, you figured it out. Okay, we're done. So it was very quick at the end. I really enjoyed the first book, and I really enjoy like mythology in general. So there was a lot of references to mythology in these books. So I wanted to kind of explore that world a little bit more. Honestly, this is probably a book I could have picked up in Barnes & Noble, flipped to the last chapter and like skimmed, okay, the main character and her love interest end up together, cool. I don't really need to read it. I'm gonna go ahead and give a summary of the story. As I said, a lot of what happens is just that like middle book type formula, traveling here, somebody joins them, they get another piece of information, they think they've caught the person, oh no, somebody else is like thwarting their plan, let's move on. So I'm not going to go over a ton of plot details. What I am going to kind of do is just a big picture plot overview and also some things that the characters are going through, because I think that's the more interesting part of the story. So before I get into it, just a quick recap of the first book, and I do have a full review of that I will link if you are interested. The main character, Io, is a cutter. So in this world, people who are otherborn, meaning that they are born with some sort of mythological type powers, mirror the powers of, in this case, like Greek gods and goddesses. So Io and her two sisters are kind of mirroring and have these powers of the fates. So she is able to cut fate threads. And there are others with different powers as well that mirror some of the powers of other mythical figures. So in the first book, Io starts out using her cutting skills as a private investigator. She's able to see everyone's fate threads, kind of follow them, and if somebody's like having an affair, she can kind of follow that thread, cut it so that that person is no longer interested in having an affair. For the most part, when threads are cut, it either takes a really long time for them to grow back, or they're just non-existent anymore. So for example, I believe it's one of Io's threads she cuts that's connected to like this pastry she really enjoys, and so she uses that thread to cut somebody else's and no longer enjoys those pastries. Like, they just completely turn her stomach. So in order to cut somebody else's thread, she has to sacrifice one of her own. In the first book, these wraiths, like undead type creatures, have been kind of wreaking havoc on the city. And they are, I say undead because their fate thread, their like life thread has been severed, and they're kind of holding it like a whip in their hand, but they're still like moving around and doing stuff, and they're talking about like justice and all of these things. So Io and her gang of misfits, from like a mob boss's right-hand assistant, whose name is either Edei or Edei. I'm gonna go with the second one. I feel like that's the more, that's the closer pronunciation. She is kind of looking to figure out who is responsible for creating these wraiths. They are very similar in kind of their attitude, the fact that they're using their life thread as like a whip. They're very similar to the Furies, who were kind of like the law enforcement previously, and they're non-existent anymore. So they're trying to solve this problem. In the first book, we kind of learned that there was this tension. There's tension between the normal people who don't have any sort of powers and the Otherborns. The Otherborns are seen as weird. They're kind of mistreated. And the Furies were kind of like in charge of their justice system, but all of these mob bosses kind of got together and were like, hey, we're not happy with this. There's a lot of other political stuff between them, and the Furies were all killed, and now it's just like kind of worse. You know, it's like the mob bosses are running everything. It's just not a great look. At the end of book one, Io finds a golden thread which is connected to a god or goddess that is probably running this whole thing that's going on. So she wraps it around her wrist and holds on to it, and that's kind of where the book ends. So Io has a fate thread which connects her to somebody else who she's like supposed to be with, and that person is Edei. And there's kind of this tension in the book where initially she thinks he's with somebody else, and then he says, you know, like, we haven't been together for a while, and then she doesn't want to tell him that they're connected by this fate thread. Then he reveals that he already knew, he found out a long time ago, and that he's really conflicted because he doesn't know the feelings that he's having. Are they because of the fate thread, or are they just his feelings? And so there is this little bit of tension between them in the first book. Where the book picks off, Io and Bianca, who was a, I guess, former mob boss. I mean, she still kind of is, but I'm gonna say former at this point, are still trying to figure out where this golden thread is leading. Now, in the last book, we find out that Bianca is partially Fury-born, because she was turned into a wraith. So her life thread was severed. She's using it as like a whip. She's kind of become a wraith, but she's functioning of her own free will. The other wraiths were kind of like undead, unthinking machines, and Bianca is an undead, fully functioning person, I guess. So she does kind of go into these like bloodlust moments, but for the most part, she is still herself. So they are following this golden thread to try to figure out who it belongs to. And as I mentioned in my thoughts at the beginning, they are thwarted all along the way. They meet this person who also has the thread looped around their ankle because they're working for these people and are trying to mislead them, and then they lose track of it, and all of this stuff happens. So they are still finding people who have been turned into wraiths, and what they've kind of figured out at this point is that the people who have been turned into wraiths that are like fully functioning need to continue eating, continue drinking, continue sleeping. And if they take like a sleeping sort of tonic, it actually really helps them. However, they are actually technically dead, so their bodies are kind of rotting away. But doing all of those things is kind of slowing the process. So some of the people that they're kind of trying to help, and Io's sisters are kind of instrumental in doing this, they're in like various degrees of rot. Something else that's looming over their heads that we learned about in the first book is that the muses kind of had this prophecy, and they were painting pictures of it. Like, it was everywhere in their art that basically Io was going to be the one to like bring destruction on the entire world. And so, you know, she's always thinking like, is this action that I'm trying to take preventing whatever that is, or should I just go with it anyway? Io and Edei are getting closer in this book, but again, there's still that like underlying tone of, are the things that we're feeling us, or are they our fate thread that's connecting us? And, you know, he's still hesitant. He still talks about potentially cutting it, and she's just kind of nervous about what that might mean. Along the way on their adventures, they meet this little girl who's been kidnapped. Her name's Tor. She was taken like on her way home from school, and she has not been turned into a wraith yet, but that's kind of the impression that they get that she was taken for. And they do find out that she is a full Fury born. So that kind of gives credence to this theory they were thinking, that somebody is using these wraiths to kind of bring back the Furies and kind of enact justice. Getting to the end of the book, like I said, the majority of the book is just all of these little things and pieces of information. The last, like, I don't know, maybe 5 chapters, it's not very long, is where like all of the action happens. So they find this goddess that this thread is connected to. She ends up stabbing Io and like slicing her through the gut. She ends up recovering, so don't worry. That would be really sad if the main character died with like 5 chapters left in the book. Some weird things happen in that interaction where Io gets hurt, like time freezes, it speeds up, it slows down. And so that's kind of like the missing puzzle piece. They finally figure it all out, that the people who are calling the shots are the goddesses of time. They're the ones that have been controlling everything. Now, throughout the story, the last book and this book also, there have been more like weird creatures, like chimera type creatures, attacking people, just showing up in places that they really shouldn't be. There's been a lot more flooding, and that's been kind of an underlying concern that's just kind of been mentioned, but nothing's really come of it. So now we get all of the answers. So these time goddesses, not only can they, you know, control time to some degree, but they can also see the past, the future. So they knew that this giant collapse was coming that was going to be like world ending to some degree. And they were trying to prevent that from happening. So in order to do that, one of the goddesses kind of put the world in a time loop. And in doing so, she like has been unconscious for years, like as long as the world has been in a time loop. So because everything is just kind of looping over and over again, certain people have had access to these maps kind of created by the goddesses and the people that they work with that show what areas are going to flood at what times, what things are going to be impacted by this type of creature, this sort of natural disaster, what is going to be happening in these different areas, which is why the very wealthy people have never really had issues with any of those things, because they had the resources and the information to know not to build their, you know, homes, businesses in those places. Which is also why Io and most of the people that she's working with who have lived in like the slums have been plagued by those things over and over and over again. And the reason they've been getting worse is because this time loop is kind of slowly wearing off, as this time goddess has been like knocked out for decades and is just kind of losing her grip on power or whatever. So I guess the decision at this point is, does Io live into this prophecy and potentially save everybody, or does she just kind of let everything continue happening status quo but possibly getting worse? And so the way that this time loop was formed is it's formed during this collapse. So the collapse never ended. It just keeps happening over and over and over again. So Io just kind of says like, screw it, you know, if we're all gonna go down, let's just go down. Let's stop living in this miserable state of, you know, knowing things are happening over and over and over. So as, you know, violence breaks out and everybody's fighting, Io grabs her brightest and strongest thread, which is her fate thread, and she uses it to kill the time goddess and get everybody out of this loop. From the way that the book ends, it seems like things are just gonna kind of calm down and everything's going to be fine. There might be some areas that are like permanently flooded and people need to relocate, but they have the map, so they kind of know what's going to happen when, and they can, you know, get people out in time. At the end of the book, Io and Edei are kind of talking about everything that happened, and, you know, she tells him, I had to use my fate thread. It was the only one that was strong enough. She had tried to kill the goddess before with just like a bunch of threads and it hadn't worked. So this time the fate thread was the only one that worked, and, you know, he says, I understand, like, that's fine, but can you see what it looks like? And remember, they don't really grow back, but there is a tiny wisp between them, and they're all, you know, they realize that they're all gonna be fine and everything's okay, and they still have feelings for each other and they're real and all of that stuff. So that's pretty much it for Hearts That Cut by Kika Hatzopoulou. I believe at the time that this video comes out, the book should be released. So if you are interested, if you read the first one and you really enjoyed it, or do you just like the topic overall and you want to check them out now that they're both out, now would be the time to do so. As always, thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll see you guys soon. Bye.